The wind didn't come in like a warning. It came in like an accusation. It hit the widow's house first, not the clapboard cabins along the road, not the livery with its loose tin roof, not the schoolhouse with its bells still swinging from last Sunday. The wind bent toward her place as if it had been looking for it all along, and for one long breath, everyone watching from their doors and porches thought, good. Let that strange stone thing finally be punished. They had waited years for it. The widow was inside, hands wet with flour, when the sound changed, not louder, deeper, like the earth itself had cleared its throat. The walls trembled, but not in the way wood does. There was no creak, no complaint. The stone only tightened, as if bracing. She didn't run for the door. She reached for the latch beneath the stairs and pulled it open. By the time the first cabin across the road came apart like a kicked crate, the widow and her children were already gone from the kitchen. The town would remember that later. They would remember a lot of things later. They had called her house ugly from the start. Stone didn't belong here, not in a farming town, stitched together with pine and oak, where a man could raise a home in a season and fix it with a hammer and some patience. Stone was slow. Stone was stubborn. Stone was for courthouses and jails and old countries across the ocean, not for a woman alone on the edge of the plains. Especially not a widow. Her husband had been buried 3 winters earlier, not far from where the cottonwoods bent toward the creek. He'd gone under with the rest of the men who tried to outrun a flash flood in spring. The town had stood shoulder to shoulder at the grave, hats in hands, already deciding what would become of her. She'd surprised them by staying, and she'd confused them by hauling stone. Not field stone, picked neat and small either. She dragged in broken limestone from the low ridge south of town, pale slabs with jagged faces. She brought them on a borrowed sled in winter, on a creaking wagon in summer, sometimes one piece at a time with a rope around her shoulders. Men offered advice she didn't ask for. Wood's warmer. Stone sweats? It'll crack in the freeze? One of them laughed and said, "You building a fort or a house?" She said nothing. She kept stacking. The children helped when they could, small hands passing mortar, wiping dust from their eyes. The youngest learned to nap to the sound of stone tapping into place. The house rose slow, painfully slow, a square shape at first, then thicker, then stranger. The walls were wider than a man's arm span. The windows narrow, set deep, with slanted stone above them like brows. When it was done, it didn't look like anything else in town. It looked like it had always been there. That made people uneasy. Storms came and went. Thunderheads rolled like distant mountains and broke themselves open across the prairie. Roofs lost shingles. Fences leaned. Once a small twister skipped along the fields and lifted a chicken coop clean into the air before dropping it upside down a mile away. Each time, the town patched and repaired and shook their heads, and each time someone would glance at the widow's stone house, standing grey and quiet, and say something like, "Well, it's still there," not impressed, just waiting. They wanted it to fail. They wanted proof that she had wasted her time, that her stubbornness had been foolish. A woman alone didn't get to rewrite how things were built. Not here. The widow knew this. She heard it in the pauses when she entered a room, in the way conversations tilted around her like water around a rock. She didn't mind. She had built the house for reasons that had nothing to do with them. The cellar beneath the stone was deeper than most, dug down until the earth held steady cool, even in August. The walls down there were stone too, fitted tight, the ceiling arched low. She had learned that shape from an old book her husband once brought home, pages yellowed and cracked. An arch doesn't fight the weight above it. It carries it. The children slept better during storms. The house didn't groan or snap. It didn't shudder like it might come apart. The sound of rain on stone was different, softer somehow, as if it had farther to fall before it reached them. Still, no one called it smart. They called it strange. The day the tornado came, the air went wrong early. Even the birds knew it. By mid-morning, the sky had turned the color of bruised metal, low and pressed down, as if the town had been pushed to the bottom of a shallow bowl. The wind stopped altogether. Leaves hung still on their stems. The horses at the hitching rail rolled their eyes and stamped. Someone joked about it being too quiet to trust. By noon, the jokes were gone. The widow had felt it while kneading dough, the pressure building behind her eyes. She sent the children to fetch water from the pump and didn't like how long it took them to come back. When they did, they were pale and breathless, hair lifting around their faces as if charged. "Ma," one of them said, and didn't finish. She didn't scold. She set the bread aside and began to move through the house with purpose, closing shutters, checking latches. When the wind returned, it came from all directions at once. A roar followed, not thunder, something lower, something that didn't end. She herded the children to the cellar door and opened it just as the first scream reached them. From the far side of town, where a roof had begun to peel. They were halfway down the steps when the sound became unbearable. It wasn't until later that she learned how the tornado moved, how it didn't strike like a blade but like a hand, gripping, twisting, pulling upward with violent patience. It took the livery first, then the feed store, then it crossed the road. People ran when they realized running wouldn't help. A man tried to hold his barn door closed and vanished with it. A woman was lifted from her porch and dropped into the yard hard enough to break bones that would never set right. The schoolhouse collapsed in on itself, the bell ringing wildly as it fell. And through it all, the widow's stone house stood in the path of it. Those who could still see thought they saw the walls flex. They didn't. The wind slammed into the stone and split around it, pouring over the roof, clawing at the corners. Shingles tore free. One of the narrow windows shattered inward, glass spraying across the kitchen. But the walls held. Down in the cellar, the children clung to their mother as dust sifted from the ceiling. The air pressed in their ears. One of them cried out, certain the house was coming down on top of them. The widow said nothing. She had both arms around them, back against the stone, feeling the vibration pass through the walls and into the earth beneath. It lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt like an hour. When the sound finally tore away, it left behind a silence so complete it rang. No one came out right away. People waited, afraid the world might still be angry. The widow climbed the steps slowly. She pushed the cellar door open with her shoulder and stepped into a kitchen that looked wounded but standing. Light poured in through the broken window, illuminating flour dust and fallen shelves. The roof sagged in one corner but had not caved. She opened the front door. The town was gone, not burned, not flattened neatly, just erased. Houses lay scattered in pieces, mere walls torn free from floors, belongings strewn, as if a giant hand had shaken them loose. The road was unrecognizable. Trees lay snapped and stripped, their bark peeled away. And in the middle of it all stood the stone house, scarred, chipped, missing part of its roof, standing. Someone screamed her name, then someone else. People came running from the ruins, bleeding, barefoot, wild-eyed. They ran not away from the destruction but toward her, toward the strange stone house they had laughed at. The widow didn't hesitate. She waved them in. "Cellar," she said, voice steady. "Careful on the steps." By nightfall, there were more people under her roof than she had ever hosted in her life. The stone held their weight, and outside, the wind carried on as if offended. No one slept that night, not really. They lay packed shoulder to shoulder in the widow's cellar, listening to the town breathe, or try to. The injured moaned softly. Children whimpered in their dreams and woke themselves crying. Somewhere above them, loose boards knocked together whenever the wind shifted, a hollow sound that made more than one person flinch. The cellar smelled of damp stone and earth, but it held steady. The air stayed cool and thick, not rushing, not collapsing. The arch overhead did not sag. Mortar dust sifted down now and then, but nothing more. People noticed that too. They noticed a lot of things in the hours after the tornado passed. They noticed that the widow moved calmly through the crowded cellar, kneeling beside the injured, tearing cloth into strips, setting broken limbs as best she could. They noticed how she never once looked up at the ceiling while she worked, never braced herself for a collapse that did not come. They noticed how the stone walls muffled the outside world. The wind still screamed beyond them, but it sounded far away, as if filtered through layers of earth and time. Someone whispered, "It ain't cracking." Someone else said, quieter, "It ain't even shifting." Those words passed along the cellar like a prayer. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The silence that followed was heavy and wrong, like a held breath that didn't know how to release. The widow climbed the steps again when the light began to change. She pushed open the door and looked out over a town that no longer resembled the place she had lived in for years. It wasn't just damage, it was absence. Where houses had been, there were only foundations or nothing at all. Roofs lay upside down in the fields. Furniture was lodged in trees. A horse lay still near the road, its harness twisted into a shape no one wanted to study too closely. The stone house stood like a marker at the edge of something final. People emerged behind her, cautious at first, then desperate. They scanned the wreckage, calling names. Some found answers quickly, others did not. The widow stepped aside to let them pass. She didn't offer comfort with words. She understood something the town was only beginning to grasp. There would be no easy rebuilding, not yet. By midday, it became clear who had survived and how. Nearly every person who had reached the widow's house before the tornado hit was alive. Those who had stayed in wooden homes, those who had tried to ride it out in barns or sheds, those who had run too late. Many of them were gone or broken beyond help. No one said it out loud at first, but everyone counted. They counted bodies, they counted absences, and they counted the walls that still stood. The stone house had taken a direct hit. That fact spread faster than anything else. Men walked around it slowly, hands on hips, eyes tracing the thick walls, the way the corners had been rounded instead of squared, the way the roofline dipped lower than most cabins, denying the wind a clean grip. One man crouched and pressed his palm flat against the stone, as if checking for warmth or life. "It should have split," he said. Another shook his head. Would have." They stood there, quiet, embarrassed by their own voices. The widow watched from the doorway. arms crossed against the chill. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her face, only a tired awareness that the house had done what she had built it to do: protect. The town gathered what it could from the wreckage and brought it to her place. Food salvaged from broken pantries, blankets torn but usable, a crate of lanterns found half buried in the dirt. They laid everything out in the yard without asking, like offerings. By nightfall, people were sleeping against her walls, inside and out. Fires burned low and careful near the stone, kept small out of instinctive respect. Someone suggested moving the injured back into the cellar if another storm came. Someone else said, "If it comes, it'll come again." That sentence hung there, unanswered. The widow finally spoke when she needed to. "We can't stay like this," she said. "Oh, not all of us, not for long." No one argued. She organized them with the same quiet authority she had used in the cellar. She sent men to check the creek for blockages. She set women and older children to sorting what could be reused. She marked spots in the earth where bodies lay beneath debris so none would be forgotten. No one questioned her right to do any of it. That surprised her. It surprised the town more. In the days that followed, the truth of the storm settled in. The tornado had not grazed them. It had chosen them. It had carved a path straight through the heart of the settlement, leaving fields intact and homes obliterated. The road would have to be rerouted. The schoolhouse would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, if it was rebuilt at all. Some families packed what little they had left and left without saying goodbye. They could not bear the emptiness. They could not bear the idea of waiting for the sky to decide their fate again. Others stayed. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go. They stayed because the stone house stood as proof that survival was not blind luck. It was preparation. Men began to ask questions they had once laughed at. How thick are the walls? Why the windows like that? What's holding the roof? The widow answered when she felt like it. She showed them the arch in the cellar. She explained how stone, when set right, did not fight the wind. It endured it. She spoke of weight and pressure, and how the earth itself could be used as an ally instead of an enemy. Some listened closely. Some bristled. A few said, "Well, it ain't for everyone." She agreed, but they kept listening anyway. Rebuilding began slow. No one had the heart or strength to raise another full house yet. They patched what they could. They dug temporary shelters. They leaned boards against the standing walls of what remained and called it enough. But every evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned uncertain, people found themselves drifting toward the widow's stone house, not always to go inside, sometimes just to stand near it. They said it made the air feel steadier. They said it felt like the ground beneath it didn't move as much. One night, a man who had once mocked her openly, laughed loudest when she hauled stone past his porch, approached her as she sat mending a torn coat. "I was wrong," he said. She looked up at him, waiting. "I thought you were scared," he continued. "Thought that's why you built it like that." "And now?" she asked. He swallowed. "Now I think you were listening." She went back to her stitching. That was answer enough. The weather turned again a week later. Not a tornado, not even a true storm, just heavy clouds, low and restless, as if the sky were remembering something it liked. The town tensed. People moved quicker. Children were kept close. Livestock was tied down or brought nearer to the stone house, despite its small yard and lack of fencing. The widow watched the clouds with a practiced eye. She had learned to read them, not perfectly, but better than most. She felt the pressure change again, the way it had before. That night, she left the cellar door unlatched. When the first gust hit, people didn't run in panic. They walked. They gathered their children, their wounded, their few remaining belongings, and they went where they knew the ground would not betray them. By the time the rain came hard and sideways, the cellar was full again. The arch held, and something in the town shifted for good. They no longer laughed at the stone. They feared the sky. The second storm never became a tornado. That somehow made it worse. It lingered. It sat above the town like a thought that wouldn't finish itself. Clouds stacked low and heavy, wind moving in fits and starts, as if testing different directions. Rain came hard, then stopped. Thunder rolled without lightning. The sky stayed the wrong color long after sunset. People waited for the sky to decide what it wanted. They waited in the widow's cellar. No one had said the word shelter. No one had declared the stone house official or safe or anything that might tempt fate. They just came, quietly, with the kind of urgency that didn't need explanation. Some brought stools, some brought bedding. One man carried a door torn from its hinges and leaned it against the wall so his wife could lie down. A boy brought a cracked violin and sat on the steps, not playing, just holding it like proof that something delicate had survived. The cellar was fuller than it had been during the tornado. The widow noticed how people arranged themselves now, not in a panicked heap, not pressing toward the center. They settled along the walls, trusting the stone at their backs. They left space beneath the arch, as if instinctively honoring its shape. She watched all of it from the edge of the room, saying little. She was tired in a way that sleep would not fix. The storm passed sometime before dawn. No roar this time. No violence sharp enough to remember clearly, just hours of pressure, of wind dragging at the world, of rain forcing its way into every weakness left behind by the tornado. When morning came, the town was still there, damaged, thinned, scarred, but standing. People climbed the cellar steps one by one and looked up at the sky like it might change its mind. When it didn't, they let out breaths they hadn't known they were holding. Something had settled, not relief, decision. It began with the well. The old wooden well cover had been torn loose in the tornado, and debris had fallen in. The water was fouled. They'd been boiling what they could salvage, rationing carefully. A man suggested digging a new one farther out, away from the ruined center of town. Another said, "Closer to the stone house." Someone else nodded. "Ground's higher there." No one asked the widow if it was all right. They just started measuring. She watched them from her porch, hands wrapped around a tin cup gone lukewarm. She could have told them the ground was rockier there, harder to dig. She could have warned them it would take longer. She didn't. They needed to learn the difference between easy and right for themselves. When the digging began, it confirmed what she already knew. The earth resisted. Picks rang against stone. Progress was slow and exhausting. Men cursed and paused and wiped sweat from their eyes. But the ground didn't collapse. The walls of the pit held firm. By the end of the second day, they struck water, clean, cold. Someone laughed, sharp and sudden, and then cried. Others joined in, voices breaking in ways that had nothing to do with thirst. They lined the stones carefully as they built the well walls upward. They made them thicker than usual. They set them tight. They did it without asking her how. They had been watching. The shift was subtle at first. A shed rebuilt near the widow's house used stone at its base instead of wood. The next one did the same. Someone reinforced a cellar wall with rock hauled in from the same ridge she'd used years earlier. The jokes stopped. So did the questions that had been meant to sound clever. In their place came something else. Respect, maybe. Fear, definitely. They had seen what the sky could do, and they had seen what endured it. Not everyone agreed with the change. A man named Hollis, broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, used to being listened to, said the town was losing its sense. He said stone took too long. He said winter would come before half these new foundations were finished. He said people were acting like the tornado was waiting just beyond the hills to punish them again. "We can't live like we're afraid of the clouds," he said, standing near the ruined schoolhouse, gesturing wide with his hands. The widow was there, passing out bandages from a crate salvaged from the doctor's office. She did not look up. "We already were," she said quietly. The crowd went still. Hollis frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She finally met his eyes. "We were afraid when we built fast, afraid when we ignored what the land was telling us, afraid of slowing down, afraid of doing it wrong." Someone murmured agreement. Hollis scoffed. "And now you think piling up rocks is bravery?" "No," she said. "I think pretending the sky won't come back is foolish." That ended it, not because she was louder, because she was right. As weeks passed, the town reorganized itself around the stone house, without ever naming it as such. Paths wore into the ground leading toward it. Children played closer to it than anywhere else, instinctively keeping it within sight. Meetings happened on its porch. Supplies were stored in its cellar, carefully catalogued and guarded. The widow allowed it. She also set boundaries. "No more than we can hold," she said. "No more than we can care for." When they asked her what she meant, she explained that safety without order became panic, that shelter without responsibility became dependence, that the house was not a promise, it was a tool. They listened. Mostly. One afternoon, long after the debris had been cleared and the dead properly buried, the widow walked the edge of town alone. She stopped where the tornado had first touched down. The ground was still marked by it, grass flattened into a strange spiral, trees scarred and bent. She knelt and pressed her hand to the earth. It felt solid. It always had been. She thought of her husband then, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with the quiet understanding that came after. He had been a good man. He had trusted the land too, but in a different way. He had believed speed and strength were enough. She had learned otherwise. That knowledge had saved lives. It also isolated her. She stood and turned back toward the town, toward the stone walls catching the late sun, toward the people moving among them like they belonged there now. She wondered what would happen when the memory of the tornado began to fade, when the sky went blue again for long enough that people started to forget. She knew how that worked. She had seen it before. The first argument about rebuilding the church happened that night. The old wooden structure was gone, reduced to splinters and a crooked bell. Some wanted to rebuild it exactly as it had been, fast and familiar. Others argued for stone, for patience, for something that would not scatter the next time the wind grew angry. Voices rose, tempers flared. The widow listened from the edge, hands folded, eyes tired. Finally she spoke. "Build it how you want," she said, "but build it where people can reach it when the sky turns." Silence followed. The decision wasn't made that night, but it had been shaped. Later, after the crowd dispersed, A young woman approached the widow on the porch. She was newly married, hands still soft, eyes wide in a way that hadn't yet learned disappointment. "My husband says we should build like you did," she said, hesitant. "I'm afraid it'll take too long." The widow studied her for a moment. "It will," she said. The young woman swallowed. "Then how did you do it?" The widow looked out over the darkened town, over the stone walls catching moonlight, over the scars that would never fully heal. "One stone at a time," she said, "and never pretending the sky was kind." The young woman nodded, though she didn't fully understand. Not yet. The wind was quiet that night, too quiet, and somewhere far out on the plains, the clouds began to gather again. The sky stayed calm for nearly a month. That, more than anything else, tested the town. Clear mornings came one after another. The sun rose clean and steady. Nights cooled the land the way nights were supposed to. The wind behaved itself, moving grain tops in soft waves instead of tearing at them. People began to breathe differently. They laughed louder. They lingered longer in the evenings. Children ranged farther from the stone house, chasing each other through open ground where debris had finally been cleared. Memory softened. It always did. The widow watched it happen without comment. She had learned that fear burned hot and fast, but comfort was patient. Comfort waited for you to look away. She kept working. While others rebuilt walls and fences, she reinforced what already stood. She repaired the roof not by lifting it higher, but by lowering its profile further. She replaced torn shingles with heavier ones, or anchoring them deeper. Inside the cellar, she added another short retaining wall, not because the old one had failed, but because it might someday be asked to do more. People noticed, but less urgently now. Some nodded approval, some smiled indulgently. A few shook their heads again, the old expressions creeping back onto their faces. "That woman still thinks the sky's coming for her," someone muttered one afternoon. The widow heard. She said nothing. The argument over the church came to a head when the foundation was laid. Hollis had pushed hard for wood. He said speed mattered. He said morale mattered. He said stone made the place feel like a tomb. Others pushed back, but less forcefully than they once had. The urgency had drained from them with each peaceful day. In the end, they compromised. Stone at the base, wood above. "It's the best of both," Hollis declared, as if he had solved something. The widow stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the shallow stonework. She saw how thin it was, how the corners met at clean right angles, how the weight of the structure would rest on confidence instead of shape. She said nothing. She had learned that lessons refused too often returned louder. The first warning came in the animals. Horses grew restless again. Chickens refused to roost. Dogs whined at empty air and pressed themselves against stone walls at night. A farmer came to the widow's porch and asked if she thought another storm was coming. She looked at the sky and said, "Not yet." He frowned. "Then why?" "Because the land remembers," she said, "even when we don't." That answer unsettled him more than certainty would have. The real warning came 3 days later, at dusk. The horizon darkened unevenly, not with the slow dignity of a gathering storm, but with patches, bruises spreading across the sky in irregular shapes. The air thickened. Sound began to behave strangely. A hammer strike carried too far. A child's laugh seemed muffled, as if wrapped in cloth. The widow felt it settle into her bones. She lit the lanterns early. People noticed that. By nightfall, clouds stacked low and heavy again, moving faster than before. The wind shifted direction every few minutes, uncertain and sharp. A meeting was called without being announced. People drifted toward the stone house. Some pretended they were just checking on supplies. Some said they wanted to talk about the church. Some didn't bother with reasons at all. The cellar door stood open. No one commented on that either. Rain came first, hard, slanted, unforgiving. It found every weakness the town had rebuilt in haste. Water forced its way through new seams. It pooled where foundations had been rushed. Wood swelled and complained. Thunder followed, close and aggressive, cracking the air open instead of rolling politely away. Still no tornado. That absence made people uneasy. They crowded into the stone cellar again, though fewer than before. Not everyone came. Some stayed in their homes, trusting that the storm would pass as others had. The widow watched the cellar fill and felt something tighten in her chest. She counted heads. There were gaps. The wind rose sharply near midnight. Not all at once, in steps, each surge stronger than the last. The widow closed her eyes and listened, not to the noise, but to the pattern beneath it. She felt how the pressure changed in waves instead of lines, how the wind dragged low, then lifted suddenly. She stood. "Down," she said. "All of you. People obeyed without question. The sound outside changed again. Not a roar, a tearing. The widow knew that sound now. The tornado did not strike the town head-on this time. It skirted it. That made it worse. The wind caught the edges of things, the parts that weren't anchored, the corners that trusted their angles too much. It lifted roofs clean off and flung them sideways. It peeled siding away in long strips. It twisted the unfinished church structure like a hand wringing out wet cloth. The stone base held. The wooden upper half did not. It collapsed inward with a sound like a body giving way. The widow felt it through the ground. In the cellar, people screamed. She pressed her palms to the stone and held steady, breathing slow, grounding herself in the shape she trusted. The tornado moved on quickly, almost lazily, as if it had come to make a point rather than destroy everything. When it passed, the silence that followed was sharper than before. They found Hollis near the church ruins, alive, pinned beneath a beam, leg shattered, blood soaking into the mud. He was conscious when they reached him, eyes wide with something close to disbelief. "I thought," he said, and couldn't finish. They carried him to the stone house, on a door torn free from somewhere else. They laid him in the cellar, where the walls did not shake and the air did not rush. The widow set his leg as best she could. He did not argue. He did not speak again that night. Morning revealed a town damaged again, but not destroyed. The tornado had grazed them, not leveled them. Enough stood that hope remained intact. But the pattern was undeniable now. Everything that had been rushed had suffered most. Everything that had been anchored had endured. People stood among the ruins and finally allowed the thought they had been circling for weeks to settle fully. This was not chance. The widow stood apart from the crowd, watching the light strike stone and broken wood alike. She knew what would come next. The hardest part always came after proof. They gathered that evening, not in anger, not in fear, but in something quieter and heavier: decision. Someone asked her to speak. She hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew how it would sound. "I didn't build my house to save the town," she said finally. "I built it to keep my children alive." No one interrupted. "If you want to build like it," she continued, "you'll have to accept what that means. It takes longer. It costs more. It asks patience when fear wants speed." Hollis, pale and propped against the cellar wall, lifted his head. "And if we don't?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Then the sky will keep teaching you." Silence followed. No one argued this time. Plans changed that night. Not on paper, in behavior. People stopped rushing. They stopped pretending. They stopped choosing familiar mistakes over unfamiliar effort. Stone was hauled again from the ridge. Foundations were widened. Corners were softened. The town did not become a fortress, but it became something else, something that listened. The widow worked alongside them, not as a leader, not as a symbol, just as someone who understood the cost of ignoring what had already been proven. And far above them, the sky watched in its own way. The town did not rebuild all at once. That was the first real change. Before the storms, rebuilding had always meant urgency. Walls raised in days, roofs slapped on before the weather could argue. Speed had been mistaken for strength, familiar shapes for safety. Now nothing moved quickly. Stone came in slow loads from the ridge, hauled with care instead of force. Foundations were dug deeper than tradition required. When wood was used, it was anchored into stone instead of resting on faith and habit. People complained, quietly, mostly to themselves. Winter crept closer with each passing week, and the old fear returned in a different shape. What if we don't finish in time? The widow heard that question often. She answered it the same way every time. Then you finish what matters first. What mattered changed how people thought. They finished cellars before walls. They finished shelters before porches. They finished places to endure before places to impress. The town began to look strange to outsiders. Low roofs, thick bases, narrow windows, fewer sharp corners. Nothing tall enough to brag about itself. It did not look proud. It looked prepared. Hollis healed slowly. His leg never set quite right. He walked with a limp afterward, favoring the side that had been pinned beneath the beam. The pain humbled him in a way no argument ever could. He spent a great deal of time sitting on the widow's porch, watching the work unfold. One afternoon, long after the church ruins had been cleared, he spoke without looking at her. "I used to think fear was the worst thing that could happen to a town," he said. She kept her eyes on the stone she was fitting into place. "And now? Now I think forgetting is worse." She nodded once. That was all the agreement he needed. The rebuilt church went up differently the second time. Stone first, not decorative, not thin. A proper base, wide and heavy, shaped to turn the wind instead of challenging it. The wooden structure above it was lower than before. The steeple abandoned entirely. Some mourned that loss. Others felt relief they couldn't quite explain. When it was finished, the bell hung closer to the ground. Its sound carried farther than the old one ever had, not because it was higher, but because the building beneath it did not sway. Seasons turned. Winter came early and hard. as if the sky wanted one last word. Snow buried fields and roads alike. The wind returned often, sharp and insistent, testing every seam and decision the town had made. The stone held, wood groaned but did not tear loose. Cellars stayed dry. The widow's house remained what it had always been, quiet, steady, unremarkable in the way mountains are unremarkable once you accept they are not going anywhere. People still gathered there during the worst nights, though less desperately now. They came to share warmth, to exchange news, to sit with the certainty that the walls around them would not suddenly decide to leave. Children grew up thinking this was normal. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Years passed. The tornado became a story told with fewer hand gestures and more silence. New families arrived, curious about the town that built the way it did. Some stayed, some didn't like the patience it demanded and moved on. Those who stayed adapted. They learned to read the sky the way others read calendars. They learned that speed was not always mercy. They learned that safety was not luck. It was earned slowly and defended quietly. The widow aged, her hair silvered, her hands stiffened. The stone outlived her strength, then her certainty, then eventually her. When she died, it was in her bed, beneath the same low roof she had trusted all those years. The storm that night passed without incident, as if respecting something it had failed to break. The town buried her on high ground, not far from where her husband lay. They built the marker from stone, thick, simple, unmovable. Long after those who had laughed at her were gone, people still told visitors about the strange stone house. They pointed to it and said, "That's why we're still here." They did not say tornado as often anymore. They said listening. And when the sky darkened, as it always does, somewhere, sometime, the town did not panic. They went where the ground was strong. They trusted what had already been proven. And the stone, patient as ever, carried the weight.